India is currently grappling with an energy crisis. We've already seen reports of load shedding in several states. Thermal plants across the country are struggling with coal shortages, indicating that the country is staring at possibly a power crisis. Now, what really has happened? That's the question. We've had a situation of increasing demand because COVID-19 has ebbed. Economic activity has increased and demand has shot up. We also are now living in a situation where more and more homes have air conditioners, more and more homes have refrigerators and are consuming more electricity. Now, contrast this with what's happening all around the world, where because of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, coal prices internationally are going up. We've been importing less coal, even as the prices have gone up, because we did not require that much when COVID-19 had impacted demand. So we're stuck literally between a rock and a hard place. Now, several state governments are trying to roll out methods to ease the pain on the final consumers. Maharashtra, for example, has decided to submit tenders for purchase of international coal, but that's not going to be the case for everyone. What are the implications of this as we stare at a very, very hot summer and temperatures are expected to rise? Obviously, consumption will go up. Will prices go up as well? Will we have more load shedding? And will this in turn impact industry? To get a sense of how deep this crisis is, I'm joined today by Harry Dhaul, Director General of IPPIA, that's the Independent Power Producers of India Association. Sabyasachi Majumdar, Senior Vice President at ICRA, is joining us today on the show. And I'm also speaking with A.K, former Director of NTPC. Welcome to all of you and thank you so much for speaking with us this evening on the India Development Debate. Mr. Dhaul, let me begin by getting your sense. We had a chance to talk about this a few weeks ago. Obviously, the situation has only worsened since then. So how are we going to get out of this jam? Is it as simple as, well, we'll have to just pay higher prices for coal by importing it? And what will be the impact of that?
Well, actually, your introduction is fairly interesting. It's covered the whole world, global issues. And I think looking at the situation as it is now, you're right, there's a strategic issue on the discoms not having enough coal and the generators are not having enough coal. And so therefore you have a situation where there's a shortage of almost 10 to 12,000 megawatts across the country from the latest figures that I've got. You also have a situation where you have 10 to 15,000 megawatts of installed capacity of gas-based projects which are not running today. You also have possibly 8 to 10,000 megawatts of power plants which are stuck in legal issues because they have got PPAs which are not being, which are being disputed, and so they are trying to figure out a way that they can start the functioning. That's one part. The second part is that, yes, you're right, the consumers will end up paying more money in terms of tariff. But there's also one other challenge. The consumers will end up paying much, much more without having power. So it's a trade-off. So I think looking at the global increase of energy prices, thanks to Ukraine, thanks to the Quad, thanks to the fact that the Chinese are picking up most of the coal from Indonesia, perhaps a lot of the South African coal which would have come to us is going to Europe. Gas has got saturated, oil prices have skyrocketed, coal has got skyrocketing as well. You have to pay a huge amount of freight to get coal from Australia. And the fact that our own coal companies are trying their best to meet the demand, but obviously the demand has gone up. And you said something very interesting. You said that everyone's got air conditioners. So for example, in Delhi, the peak which used to be morning and evening has now gone up to 2 o'clock in the morning. From 6 o'clock in the evening or 5 o'clock in the evening, the peak is right going almost the whole night. So there is a huge increase in demand. And I think you are going to face some difficult times, but I think also the government is on its toes and it is trying its best by monitoring by 24/7 what they need to do. But I think there's going to be a little bit of a pain going forward. You either pay for power or you don't get the kind of quality power that you need.
Let's face some of those facts. We are a country where some sections of society are consuming much more power, more whether it's ACs, refrigerators, so on and so forth. And we're also a country where a lot of power is subsidized or absolutely free for some sections of the society. That's part of our political ecosystem, if I may say so. In this scenario, Mr. Jha, what really now needs to be done? Now, the eventual consumer, not all of them will pay. So will some then pay more? Or will we have to grapple with more load shedding, even in highly urbanized areas this time round?
As you said in the beginning, that the load shedding is already a reality and it's happening in most part of the country. But if you look at the problem per se, it has mainly three areas. One is that whether we have sufficient capacity, installed capacity to meet the demand, and if we have sufficient capacity, then whether we have sufficient fuel to generate. Now, today's situation, we are talking about having power plants having the critical stock. They have all become critical, less than 7 days stock. But that doesn't mean that the power plant should stop generation. So as long as you are hand to mouth, the generation should not be hampered. Now we have seen that September-October crisis last year, where the interministerial coordination was possible to feed coal to each power plant so that their daily generation is not affected. As long as we are working in tandem, the Ministry of Coal, the Ministry of Power, and the Ministry of Railways, these three are very important to work in tandem, then we can keep on maintaining that 6 or 7 days stock and still able to get everyday supplies and keep on generating. But I come to the other question that when we talk about the total supply chain of the power, the coal company has to be paid by the GenCos. The GenCos have to be paid by the distribution companies, and distribution companies are still struggling because of the government policy, the ecosystem of giving free power. Now, these free powers are to be given by the government to the discoms. Now, what is happening, since most of the discoms are a government company, so they do not get it in time, and they get 6 months, 7 months, 8 months late, and they do not get any interest on that. In the meanwhile, to pay to the generating companies, these distribution companies have to borrow from the bank and pay to them, thereby incurring additional interest expenditure, which is not paid by the government, because they, being government company, do not demand interest from the government. So unless the entire chain of the power production is financially strong and healthy, these crises will keep on coming time and again. The second thing is that you have put knowing fully well that we do not have enough indigenous coal capacity right now. There is no alternative but to import coal and supply power 24/7. Now, if we have to import coal, then we have to be driven by the market factors. And as per that, the tariff will definitely increase. Now, discoms are not willing to buy costlier power and willing to go for load shedding because their financial position is bad. And we all know that why the financial position is bad. So unless the whole system is corrected, we had so many reforms in the power sector, and every time the improvement is for 2 years and 3 years, and again we slide back to the old position. So it requires a lot of political will. There are some states which are running very well, in spite of being a government distribution company. But then there are many who are not. And I am just surprised that why the states which are running well and those who are not running well, and they are the neighboring state, why they are not feeling the political compulsion to emulate what the successful state is already doing. So this is something which needs to be addressed.
No, this is interesting, Mr. Jha, because
every now and then, and the problem.
One second, this is interesting, Mr. Jha, because what you're describing is an endemic issue in India, where the whole chain is compromised financially per se. There are a lot of people just not paying eventually for the power they're consuming. That's the problem that's led to less investments, etc. So you mentioned that there's some examples where this has been rectified. Can you elaborate on that?
No, look at the Gujarat. Gujarat distribution companies are not running in loss. and why the neighboring states cannot also perform like that. And it is not today. Even before 2014, if you look at the award which is being given to the best distribution company, every time it goes to the Gujarat Discoms. So they have been doing it for, I think, last 10 years or so, more than that. So the question is that if one state can do, why others cannot do? And it is not that they are losing election because they are not giving free power or whatever it is. So the question is that whether we have a political will, whether we have a system which can take care of that. That is the issue. And I will come to the third point, which I said that in the last 5 years or so, there has been hardly any investment in the thermal power sector. Now, looking at the demand increase, if you're talking about 8% GDP growth every year, then at least 6% power growth is required to be done. From where that will come? The gestation period for a power plant, the fastest is 6 years from the date of feasibility report approval. Now, if we are not doing investment for last few years, then down the line, we are staring at a power crisis, which will be much more severe than what we are experiencing today. So there has to be a clear demand projection and the gap and how the investment will come and who will invest, who will add the capacity, because 2070 is far off when we have promised the net zero. In this period, there will be 2 cycles of new power plant with 25 years life each. We can add today one capacity, retire it at 25 years, add another capacity and retire that in 25 years. And that will take you to 2070.
This is a different angle to this entire story, that India is committed to move to cleaner energy, but is dependent on dirty fuel, as it's called, as of now. That is the situation that we are now facing. Mr. Majumdar, let me come to you now, and some interesting data that ICRA has also put out, where by Q3, global coal prices, if I'm not mistaken, are expected to go up as high as 55%. What then does that mean for India and Indian consumers?
See, let's look at it this way. In a normal year, until about, let's say, FY21, almost 8 to 10% of the total, coal which was being used by the thermal power sector was imported coal. During FY21-22, because of the weak financial position of the DISCOMs, many of them stopped buying power from, GENCOs which were using imported coal because the coal prices are also shorter. So last year, only about 4% of the total, coal which was used in the domestic thermal power sector was based on high-cost imported fuel. That is also, in fact, one of the reasons which is, adding to the problem of the low coal stockpile with the thermal power plant. And what it means is that if we wish to boost our production and offtake of power by having more imported coal, then proportionately to that extent, higher price will have to be paid for the power which is being used, which is difficult given the financial position of the DISCOMs. Although technically, of course, all this, cost increase would be passed on ultimately to the consumer. We know that this whole, process of pass-through of the fuel or the so-called FPPC adjustment usually does not happen on a very regular basis. Typically there's a lot of lag. And given the stretched financial position of the DISCOMs as well as the entire value chain, I think Mr. Jha makes a very, pertinent point that it's not so much a technical issue, but a commercial or a working capital issue. Even if there's a tariff, hike, it will happen with a certain lag. Until that time, the DISCOMs and the GENCOs will face a cash flow mismatch.
Mr. Dhaul, what is the extent of tariff hike that needs to be made to ensure that there is enough supply right now?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that question, because whatever is the tariff hike, the issue that Mr. Jha has said, and I think Sabyasachi Majumdar has alluded to, is you don't get paid. There is a huge issue on getting a higher tariff, but you don't make any payments. So with the result, the generating companies don't get money, and because they don't get money, they don't pay the coal companies. So it's not about tariff hike. I think the issue is much simpler in the sense that the guy who's supplying you power needs to get paid. In between, the regulators stepped in and the government stepped in and said, you have to have a payment security mechanism. And if you have a 25-year contract, some of our members shared this with us. They said, you know what, if there's a payment delay or a non-payment, what do? We have a LC for 3 weeks or maybe 4 weeks. If we encash that LC, we have ruptured our relationship with the DISCOM. But we have to live with the DISCOM for the next 20 years, 25 years. So it's a token situation. And I think the DISCOMs need not to be blamed because they're in a soup and they need to get out of that soup. And the only way to get out of that soup is that this nonsense about giving free power, which has got nothing to do with the power sector, it's a political issue, should be, if I can use the word siloed, identified, and that much money should they should make sure that that money is flowing into their cash flow so that they can pay off the generating companies. I remember that some time back, the amount of money Maharashtra distribution company owed to the Mahagenco was a few thousand crores. Now, obviously, Mahagenco cannot pay for the coal, right? So he can't generate. And therefore, this whole cycle goes around in circles. Point one. Point two, I think it's time India decided to have a strategic reserve of coal. And they should do that because just like the way we have a strategic reserve for oil, okay? In case of an emergency, we can dip into our strategic reserve, which is built up 5, 10, 20 million tons. Indian as well as foreign imported coal is lying there. Anybody wants it in an emergency can be used. Like right now we are having a crisis. The next point that I want to touch on is the point that Jha Saab mentioned, that everybody is talking about renewable energy and net zero. But the point is, in the transition, when 70% of your power is generated by coal, how are you going to go forward without having addition of thermal capacity? Nobody is adding thermal capacity as we speak. For the last few years, there's nothing new happening of substantial amount. So this country is going to face a much bigger crisis in the times to come. The availability of coal will go away, but there will be no capacity left to generate power. And lastly, the power sector in the last 5 years, 7 years, has been considered as the most terrible sector for banks. Banks are not willing to finance power sector per se. So the result is that capacity which had been built up has now either been destroyed totally or partially, depending on the new banking laws. And what is my saying by that? On the one hand, the DISCOM is not paying you. On the other hand, the banks are not being paid. So the banks are taking you into liquidation. So here is a situation where you're destroying national assets in the name of a regulation or a law of something where you have you're not the cause of the problem. So this needs to be fixed. And you see, you can't push it too much because while government is trying very hard to fix the problem, it's such a major problem which has been built up over the last 20, 25 years that you can't push it beyond a point because most of the DISCOMs and the generating companies in this country are controlled and owned by the government. So you have to live in this environment. And you have to live in this environment and get realistic. So if you're not getting money from banks and you're not getting money from DISCOMs, then what do? You just sink. And that's exactly what's happening. Some projects have been picked up by some of the big industrial power generating companies in the private sector for maybe 10%, 20%, 30% of the value. Immediate loser is the bank, but it's a bigger loss as a national asset. That asset which was financed, built up as a thermal power station has disappeared forever.
Let me take that question to you, Mr. Majumdar, though. What is the kind of tariff hike that needs to be done and that we can expect from those who are paying for the electricity at the end of the day? Are tariff hikes on the anvil?
So let's look at, let's ignore for time being the current power crisis. Even before this power crisis happened, there was still a gap of about 40-50,000 crore at least. We don't have the numbers for audited numbers for 21-22, but there was already a huge amount of gap between what the DISCOMs were earning from power sales and what was the total cost, including coal, debt servicing, everything. So there's already a huge gap, at least I would say not less than 50 paisa or so. So you'd have to increase that 50 paisa. Now 50 paisa, of course, the total revenue that you're earning, you're getting something from the subsidy, something from the power sales, and within power sales, of course, you'll be earning, let's say, 8 rupee, 9 rupee, or even 10 rupee from high-paying customers such as industrial and commercial, while you'd be earning next to nothing. In fact, you'll be losing money on sales to the agriculture and the low-end distribution segment. So first thing is that loss has to be made good. That gap has to be made good. Of course, part of the gap would be made good by the fact that we'll have to reduce the AT&C losses. Typically, most regulators specify anywhere between 15 to 20% as the normative AT&C loss for full recovery of cost. Whereas in most of the states, we will see that the actual losses are somewhere anywhere between 5 to 10% higher than what the regulator allows. So, of course, part of the losses can be made good by reducing the AT&C loss. But even if you account for that, still there's a fundamental gap between your cost of sale and your actual revenue. And the reason very often is that the subsidy is not so much that the subsidy is not paid, because subsidy is determined on the basis of the tariffs, tariff order, which is passed by the regulator at the start of the year, or based on the commitment by the state government. The real issue is that the subsidy, which is determined for the purpose of tariff finalization, very often that is a major understatement compared to the actual subsidy requirement based on what are the actual subsidized units which are being sold to the agriculture and low-end consumer. So first thing is we'll have to cover that gap. And then, of course, we'll have to take care of these short-term spikes. It's not that this spike is going to last forever. Obviously, as we know, hydro kicks in, some more low-cost power will be available, and this curve is going to flatten. But fundamental issue is that if you are able to address the basic issue of gap between the revenue and cost of sales, a lot of the problems will disappear, because the discoms will be able to make payments to the generating companies in time, and generating companies will be able to stock up in time. For instance, the stock requirement actually for Gencoms is 24 days. Now, if they had been able to, if they had the financial muscle to stock up 24 days of coal, all this problem would not have arisen.
Yeah.
The fundamental issue is that the fundamental, even after excluding the spikes, the fundamental gaps have to be addressed.
So 24 days, and that's very right. 24 days is the norm of the coal that has to be stocked up. At the start of this financial year, the average across the country was 9 days of coal. So we're really living on the edge here. What are the immediate solutions, Mr. Jha, that can be looked at? We know that there have been many high-level meetings, as at least 12 states are facing load shedding. It's possibly only going to get worse. If you were to advise some of those troubleshooters right now, what would you say?
As I told you, if you look at the figures of the Coal India right now, there are the FY22, they produced the record coal production they had. And this year also, by 15th of April, whatever data is available, they have produced 16% more than what they produced last year. So the question is that how this coal can be carried to the power plant. There is a shortage of railway rakes, which cannot be corrected overnight. So the Coal India is telling that go for the road cum rail transportation, RCR scheme. Now the RCR scheme has a lot of problems with respect to the wastages, and it also has a higher cost. But many private players are already availing that RCR scheme. So RCR scheme has, of course, it is the second best way other than having the railway transportation. But then there is no choice. So there are many private and even government companies are going for the road cum rail scheme of transportation, which is being given by the Coal India Limited. Now, as I told you that the crisis, if you have जैसे आपके घर में अगर 9 दिन का खाना है तो आप भूखे नहीं रहोगे. So if you have a 9 days stock, that doesn't mean that you stop generating. You keep on generating as long as you have even a single day stock, but as long as it is getting replenished on the daily basis. So what is important is that whether the Coal India and the railways put together are able to supply the daily requirement of coal, so that the 9 days stock remains the 9 days stock, or at most it goes down to 8 days stock for this intermittent period where the load is very high because of the summer. And then comes the monsoon season where there will be some respite from the heat, and then load will slightly come down, and then probably we can try to build up the stock. But again, there is a catch that during the monsoon season, the mine production goes down.
Absolutely. That's what happened last year. Mines got flooded. That's why we were short.
The only option you have is the imported coal.
Yeah.
Now, to get an imported coal, Mr. Sabyasachi was telling that the gap between the revenue realized and the revenue generated. So, what I would try to say is that the DISCOMs submit the annual revenue requirement every year to the state regulatory commission, where they say that this is my requirement for the next year, and this is how I propose to meet my requirement by increasing in tariff for different sections. Now, because of the free power and the cross subsidy happening, the industries are getting power which are very costly. I will give you an example that the railways were getting power at the cost of 8 rupees, 9 rupees because of this cross subsidization. Now railways have their own captive station. Therefore, now they are getting power at 4 rupees, 5 rupees.
Absolutely.
process, they are
I've
saving
unfortunately
4
absolutely run out of time, but this is a topic that we will come back to again and again. I will have to wrap here, and my apologies for that, but thank you so much to all of you for joining us. I invite you back again soon to update our viewers on what really is going on with this power crisis. Thanks once again.
Thank you so much.